Gamar Chatima Tova, and welcome to our service. There is a story told about an elderly gentleman, bent over in pain, walking with a cane, who goes to see the rabbi and goes slowly into the rabbi's office. 10 minutes later, the man comes out, walking upright, moving with speed and grace, and the office manager says to him, "Did the rabbi heal you with faith?" And he says, "No, he simply gave me a cane that is not 6 inches too short." A simple gift can make a huge difference in someone's life. How, what, and when we give says a lot about a person. Giving and taking defines humanity. On Kol Nidre, when we think about our most important decisions and actions of the past year, and prayers and plans for the year to come, it is critical that we think about what kind of person we are based on what we give and what we take from others, even from God. In our daily online Musar class, we are currently studying a text called Strive for Truth by Rabbi Eliyahu Dessler. He explains that the two powers of giving and taking are at the roots of all characters, traits, and actions. There is legitimate taking and healthy taking, and legitimate and healthy giving as well. In his book, Social, Why Our Brains Are Wired to Connect, Matthew Lieberman explains that the human brain is wired to be social so that we will provide for our children when they are young. Our ability to work together in cohesive units comes from that wiring. That need is more than just legitimate taking and giving. It is at the heart of the human success story. Legitimate giving ranges from gifts to friends to tzedakah for the financially insecure. We give presents to friends and family no matter how much they may have. That is a sign of the strength of our relationship. We take throughout our lives. We take help, advice, and material goods. Some of us have had the blessing of giving life to others and sustaining life. And these may be the greatest forms of giving of all. Judaism is built on a concept of giving and taking from God. The idea that God gave life to every being is the essence of the Bereshit, of the Genesis story. In the 2nd chapter, it tells us in the book of Bereshit that God formed the human from soil's humus, blowing into his nostrils the breath of life. The human became a living being. Rashi explains that this means that God gave us both earthly and heavenly material as gifts. This is the ultimate giving on God's behalf. Then God gives Torah to the people of Israel. God gives us the land of Israel. In return, God needs us to give our mitzvot through the repayment of our mitzvot. And this becomes a triangle of God giving the land of Israel to the people of Israel for the sake of repayment. And this is at the heart of the Torah and Jewish thought. It is the rubric through which we see all of biblical tradition. We also need to feel that we are reciprocating our blessing to God in order to help give us spiritual meaning. Tomorrow morning, I plan to explore the idea of faith in God in this modern world. Certainly, a central challenge to our faith at all times is the failure of expectation to give and take on both sides What happens when one is observant of mitzvot, yet bad things happen to us? It is that it seems that God is not living up to a sacred agreement of the give and take that strengthens our resolve, potentially, to believe, or does it weaken it? When I was in the Theresienstadt synagogue that I spoke about on Rosh Hashanah, one of the verses that I saw on the wall came from the part of the daily morning service where we lower our heads and call out to God in special supplication. The words painted on the synagogue were Ana Shuv, Mecharnocha, Berachum Segula Asher Becharta. Please return us from your torment and have mercy on those whom have chosen you. In other words, they were saying, we have done our part of the deal, God. Please live up to your part of the deal now. Protect us from the type of horror that we are facing. It is as if you are stealing from us, even though we have been faithful to you. The balance of give and take between the Jewish people and God at the moment of the Holocaust was broken. The verse in the synagogue in Theresienstadt was demanding a rebalance. As humans, we receive a huge benefit from giving to and taking from each other. We give food and material goods to family and friends. We give love, support, and education. We give social and emotional nurture. We give to others in order to sustain community. One of the facts shared by our guide on our trip to Theresienstadt was that the Nazis purposely limited the amount of food and water. The Jews had the ability to distribute limited rations among themselves, so they gave the biggest portion to the children. Even in the worst of conditions, the Jewish victims of Nazi oppression provided first to those who were least equipped to fend for themselves. When the Nazis tried to turn us into animals, they were the subhumans. But we maintained our humanity through our holy giving. Giving builds an inner strength. Science journalist Ingrid Winkelgren wrote that self-esteem is something we all want, and experts say we need for our mental health. The Association for Psychological Science shows that the best way to boost self-esteem is to forget about yourself altogether and to think about others. I have a cousin in her 90s, and one of her weekly highlights is to volunteer making meals for people who are ill. Her giving creates meaning and reason to exist. The cousin was born in the town of Oświęcim, Poland, where the Nazis built Auschwitz. When I visited the town, I saw that it was beautiful, and the Jewish community in which my cousin grew up had significant wealth. Like the rest of our family, virtually everything was taken from her. Despite that, it is her giving that means so much to her, even today. Giving can actually cause us to love another person even more by implanting part of ourselves into the other. Rabbi Dessler wrote a beautiful insight that I'd never considered before studying his book with our Beth Israel Musar group. He wrote, "We usually think that it is love which causes giving, because we observe that a person showers gifts and favors on the one the person loves. But there is another side to the argument. That is, that giving may bring about love for the same reason that a person loves what he himself is created or nurtured. The person recognizes it in himself, whether it is a child brought into this world, an animal he has raised, a plant he has tended, or even the thing he has made, a house he has built, a person is bound to love the work of his hands, for in it he finds himself. There are even consequences for illegitimate giving. Giving reluctantly, out of anger or for glory, is not good giving. But Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel taught that the basic problem is neither what is the right action or what is the right intention. The basic problem is what is the right giving. Even illegitimate giving in Judaism still constitutes giving. It is better to give for the wrong reason than not at all. The Rambam wrote that giving tzedakah begrudgingly is the lowest form of giving, but people are still benefiting. A person who receives anything with a smile and love, though, receives so much more than the person who's receiving something with a grimace and hesitation. Imagine how the receiver must feel when putting out their hand in need. Far worse than illegitimate giving is illegitimate taking. The gravest form of illegitimate taking is murder. After that comes stealing. According to Jewish tradition, we should do all that we can to not steal. Not even a dime, not even by accident. It is the reason that the entire book of Mishnah and Talmud was written, called Baba Metzia, which is dedicated to the return of lost property to its original owner. And while I was in Europe this summer, I was constantly reminded that the entire Nazi regime was built on the core idea of legitimizing illegitimate robbery and taking and stealing, both robbery of life and material. But illegitimate taking is much and can be much more passive and subtle, even if it is completely by accident. Heschel also wrote that some people take without giving anything in return. All giving should be repaid with at least gratitude and a thank you, even to God, through prayer and blessings. As Talmud Brachot taught, Rabbi Hanina Bar Papa said, anyone who derives benefit from this world without a blessing, it is as if he stole from God and the community of Israel. Rabbi Joseph Telushkin wrote, I know people who would never think of leaving a taxi or restaurant without thanking the driver or server and leaving a generous tip, but they are sometimes far stingier with grateful words to those who do the most to enhance their lives, their spouses, family members, and friends. They suffer from an inability to express love and gratitude, to thank those dear to them for specific favors and kindnesses. The word shalom, which means peace, comes from the word shalem, which means wholeness. We can only bring about peace through whole transactions in this world. Giving and taking is such an important part of life that we form our perception of other people based on it. We must be careful not to judge others because sometimes we are wrong. There is a story about a wealthy Jew who lived in Krakow, Poland in the 17th century, known as Yosela the Miser. No one thought that he shared his wealth with anyone, so the community buried him on the outside of the Ramah synagogue when he passed away. Then Rabbi Yom Tov Heller told the public of Yosela's unending acts of quiet tzedakah and giving. Rabbi Heller insisted that he be buried next to Yosela. He knew that this man was no miser, but a tzaddik in hiding. I saw Yosela's grave when I was in Krakow and was so moved by the importance of his story. You never know who is generous and who is not. We only know ourselves. We are often quick to recognize when someone else is cheating us, but we should be just as quick to recognize when we are cheating others. It can destroy a friendship or even familial relationships. It is important for us to ask ourselves if we are living up to the end of the deal that has been created. As Rabbi Dessler wrote, the best relationship between two people is when both achieve and practice the virtue of giving. Their love will never cease, and their lives will be filled with happiness and contentment for as long as they live on this earth. If I care about the other and maintaining a relationship with the other, I will follow sage advice I once learned from a rabbinic friend of mine. Saying a good relationship is not 50-50, it is 100-100. I should put in 100% of myself and hope for the other side to do so in return. And if they do not, that is okay as well, since they put in all that I could. We need to spend our entire life reflecting on the balance of how much we give and take. There are times that we need to give more, such as when our children are young, and times when we need to receive more, such as when we are ill. But at other times we need to seek a healthy balance of giving and taking. God will decide our outcome this year, but we will decide who we will become this year. We will decide what we give and what we take. By doing that, we will decide what kind of Jews and what kind of humans we will be. As we start this high holiday season with Rosh Hashanah, many of us are looking to enrich our spiritual lives. Rabbi David Wolpe likes to say, spirituality is what you feel, theology is what you believe, and religion is what you do. May this year be a year in which we become more religious by balancing our giving and taking. Gamar Chatima Tova. May we all be inscribed in the book of life. Gamar Chatima Tova, and welcome to our service today. Jewish Federation of Greater Vancouver CEO, Ezra Shenkin's father, Zev Shenkin, collaborated on a recently published book of Jewish humor. He contributed perhaps, maybe not so funny, but the most powerful and meaningful Jewish joke ever written. A comedian dies and goes to heaven. He meets God and says, "Are you okay with Holocaust jokes?" God says, "Try me." The comedian tells God the joke. God says, "I don't get it." The comedian replies, "Well, I guess you had to be there." After my trip this summer to Central Europe and Eastern Europe, which included a lot of Holocaust-related learning and touring, two questions naturally keep surfacing. How could humans do this to other humans? And how could God allow this to happen? The Shoah affects the faith of its victims and survivors. For some, it strengthened their belief in God. For others, like my father, it broke their belief. But what about those of us who live in good times, in a place of prosperity and freedom, but face normal trials and tribulations? Can we doubt God? Absolutely. Some even suggest that it is in good times that we face more challenges to our faith. As Talmud Brachot states, a person had a cow. At one point he fed it choice food, and soon thereafter the cow kicked him. He said to the cow, "What caused you to begin kicking me if it were not the food that I fed you?" It is in times of abundance that those of us who are inclined to question God's existence are likely to do so. Adin Steinsaltz comments on this quote, "The animal or the person is led to kick because they have too much good. In the synagogue in the Theresienstadt concentration camp, I saw the words an artist had painted on the wall, the eastern wall. Da milifne ata omed, know before whom you stand. This verse comes from Talmud Brachot and is commonly found on almost every synagogue in the world. But did the Jews need this reminder? Considering their predicament, they must have known what was happening and been thinking about God. For those of you who can read Hebrew and understand Hebrew, you may be looking at the words behind me. They do not say, Da milifne ata omed. Instead, they read, Ivdu et Hashem b'simcha, from the Psalms, worship God and joy. I chose these words 11 years ago when we rebuilt Beth Israel. I felt that our community needed to be reminded more about the joy of prayer than the fear of God. We certainly do not feel abandoned by God here in Vancouver, but have we abandoned God? In 19th century Poland, the Kosko Rabbi stated that there is nothing more whole than a broken heart. Maybe that reflected in faith in the Theresian Jewish prisoners. To be a Jew means that we must wrestle with God and a God concept, despite what we may or may not believe. Starting in Germany in the 18th century and spreading through Europe as part of the general European Enlightenment, Jews were given a new social, economic, and educational opportunities that they had never enjoyed before. This was called the Haskalah, or the Enlightenment. We Jews often find it challenging today because we are all a part of that product of the Haskalah. The idea of not believing in God, in being a secular Jew, or identifying with Judaism culturally is a direct outcome of the Haskalah. And therefore, when we find it challenging to speak about God, this is something that comes from that time period. It's not actually so common these days even to speak about God, certainly in a conservative synagogue. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if someone even complains that I did a high holiday sermon on God and not a more relevant topic. Believe it or not, though, God and the questions about God are actually more relevant to Judaism than bagels and lox. I'm sorry for bringing up food at a moment like this. We speak about theology a lot in our daily online Musar class on Jewish ethics. The great Musar teachers believe that God's interaction in the world is a reason to behave properly. Many suggested that God will punish and reward us in the world to come based on our behavior in this world. The Musar rabbis see God as interacting with humans in a very real way. I have to admit that black and white perception of God in our class has challenged the students and me as well. But it is impossible to traditionally study Jewish texts without this idea of God. The Musar teachers base their views on thousands of years of Jewish teachings and varying concepts of the divine, some of which resonate well with us today and others that do not. There are a number of ideas of God throughout biblical tradition. In Genesis, we encounter a God who speaks with the biblical heroes. In Exodus, we have a God who punishes Egypt, saves the Israelites, and even gives the Torah. In the book of Isaiah, we have a visit with God who has a physical body. Isaiah wrote, I beheld my sovereign seated on high on a lofty throne. The skirts of God's robe were filling the temple. Seraphim stood in attendance, each with 6 wings, 2 covering God's face, 2 covering the body, and 2 to fly with. Isaiah has a vision of a very physical God who is a man on high. 1,000 years ago, Moses Maimonides taught that this was a metaphor. God, he says, has no defined body, no beginning and no end. But I am not sure that Maimonides' reading of the text is correct. I think that Isaiah really meant what he said. Our confusion over God is exacerbated by the fact that the Bible and Jewish tradition do not give us one clear idea of God. Despite the murkiness, though, we need to believe in something greater than ourselves. We all need a spiritual path. As Rabbi Dessler, whom I quoted last night, stated, when the Almighty created human beings, he made them capable of both giving and taking. God is the giver par excellence. His giving is pure giving, for he takes nothing in return. He can take nothing because he lacks nothing. Our service to God is not for God, but for our own, since we need a means of expressing our gratitude to him. In his book, Man Seeks God, My Flirtation with the Divine, writer and journalist Eric Weiner begins by telling the story of how he ended up in the hospital one day with a case of bad indigestion that seemed to be something far worse. While putting an IV into his arm, the nurse asked quietly if he had found God yet. And that was a catalyst for thinking more about the subject. Eric Weiner had not really thought much about God or his Judaism until that point. When we face our most difficult moments and our own potential mortality, God plays a role for even the most devout atheists among us. Rabbi Simcha Zissel, who was sick for most of his life, wrote, "Surely it is in prayer itself that we come closest to God. When one approaches God for one's needs, recognizing him as the sole source of all that is, denying all power to oneself and to nature, is not this in itself the highest form of attachment to God?" Greg Epstein, the Harvard University humanist chaplain, wrote in his book, Good Without God, What a Billion Non-Religious People Do Believe. It is gloriously and utterly wrong to assume that living human beings must have a conscious, purposeful creator, he wrote, the same way that the pocket watch does. I find it very interesting that Greg Epstein is a rabbi trained in the Jewish humanist program and works as a chaplain and not a therapist or a psychologist. Even he clearly understands that he and his followers need something greater. An idea of God, even if it is one that they refuse to believe in, but one that must be acknowledged. Maybe God needs us, or we need God to need us. Abraham Joshua Heschel wrote about two Jews who meet on a train after the Shoah. At first, the one Jew is so angry that he refuses to believe in God or engage in any religious Jewish acts. Shortly thereafter, the angry survivor takes out his talit and his tefillin, and he starts to pray. The other Jew asks, "What are you doing?" He responds, "It suddenly dawned on me how lonely God must be. Look with whom he is left." I felt sorry for God. Heschel also taught that God is not a being detached from humans to be sought after, but a power that seeks, pursues, and calls upon us. Even according to biblical tradition, there is an idea of God wanting us to need God. It states in Psalms, "The Lord looks down from heaven on humankind to find a person of understanding, a person mindful of God." Wrestling with other human beings creates stronger relationships. Dr. Elizabeth Hall of Michigan State University wrote, "A large amount of research in the communication field has focused on conflict, since it is an important and unavoidable part of being in a close relationship. Fortunately, the research has determined that conflict can be quite healthy for relationships. The same is true for our connection with God. In fact, Jacob wrestles with an angel of God in Bereshit while he is trying to cross the Yabok River. After succeeding in his attempt to wrestle with the angel, Jacob is renamed by this mystery being, Yisrael, the one who wrestles with God. Thus, the very name of our people does not invoke a clear idea of faith, but rather the opposite. The Kotzker Rabbi said that when the Torah states, "You shall not make molten gods for yourselves," it means do not have a rigid image of God. Rabbi Shai Held explains that the incompatibility of God's ways with human understanding, according to the Kotzker Rebbe, is the very essence of our being. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel explained that it is within our power to seek God, but it is not necessarily within our power to find God. I must admit that if you wanted to use Jewish tradition to argue against me by saying that the Bible demands absolute faith, you would be on solid ground. For example, Moses is punished for trying to obtain water from a rock by hitting it and not speaking to it. The Torah tells us that that is because Moses lacked faith in God, that God would perform a miracle. But that was Moses. No one else since Moses has been like him or had the relationship with God that Moses had. Truth be told, if Moses had doubts, then we certainly can as well. Our tradition makes that very clear. In his book entitled God is a Question, Not an Answer, William Irwin tells a story that one day the followers of a beloved rabbi approach him with trepidation and tell him that the village non-believer is on his way to present the rabbi with conclusive proof that God does not exist. When the non-believer came to the rabbi for the purpose, the rabbi listened carefully. The rabbi then said one word to him, after which they both burst into tears and embraced. When his followers asked the rabbi what he had told this person, he said, Efshar, Hebrew for maybe. Rabbi Harold Kushner wrote that when he first started as a congregational rabbi, he saw himself as a defender of the faith who needed to convince other people to believe in God. After arguing with a congregant about God's existence, the congregant said to him, if a rabbi can't make a better argument for God's existence, well, who can? I guess there's no persuasive argument. Rabbi Kushner explained that one day, an astute colleague shared with him a tactic that he uses. Instead of arguing with your congregant and hoping to change his mind, he would say to him, tell me about this God that you do not believe in. There are a lot of gods I do not believe in. Maybe we'll discover that we both reject the same notion of God, and then maybe we can find an understanding of God that we both accept. I love this approach. One of the verses painted on the wall in the synagogue in Terezin from the daily morning service, Uvechol zot, shimcha lo shechenu na'at shechenu. And despite all of this, we have not forgotten your name. Please do not forget us. At the moment of despair, the Jews of Terezin painted a statement of complete faith on the wall of their synagogue. One may ask how they could do that. On the one hand, one could also ask how they could not do that. While their world was being destroyed and everything stolen from them, the Nazis could not steal their faith. I'm sure that those Jews had doubts as we do today, but the Jews beat the Nazis. by holding strong to what they believed in and continuing to persevere no matter what was thrown their way. They did not write, "We have perfect faith." They wrote, "We have not forgotten you. Please do not forget us." Gamar Chatima Tova. May we all be written into the book of life.